This morning I posted a video talking about how it's really important that we address this fact that many Christians still believe God commanded genocide in the past, because throughout history, this has given a pretense, a precursor, a plausibility framework for Christians to consider that God might be commanding the same kind of violence against civilian populations, both in the present and potentially in the future. And I gave a very concrete example of a far-right MAGA Christianity movement that views Donald Trump as a prophetic figure, that views us in the end times with a final clash between good and evil, and potentially the restoration of some millennial American republic, and that violence may be employed in the achievement of these aims of God's kingdom coming in its fullness and his judgment coming upon the nations. And this is serious stuff. So I posted this video this morning and I got, several comments. I was going to respond to one comment, which is a flat up troll, and I usually just ignore trolls. I'm going to engage this troll. I'm going to make an exception, but don't get used to me engaging trolls. For the most part, I do abide by the old adage that you should not feed the trolls. But I'm going to engage that comment, and I'm going to just briefly address a couple other comments that were posted. And I'm going to say here right now that I usually don't engage comments on YouTube, and I don't read most of the comments, not because I don't care about what people have to say, but I just don't have the time. I squeeze out these videos in the little bit of time I can find in my schedule. I'm usually taking 15, 20 minutes to put a video out there, and I don't have time to keep up with most of it after it is out there. And that's just the way it is. My apologies if you post things and you don't get a response. But please don't assume that it's because I just have no response I could possibly give to you. And also don't assume it's because I don't care. It's just that I don't have time to engage with all of these comments, but I'm going to engage with these ones now. So let's start with the first two, and then I'll save the troll comment for last. Okay, this comment was just posted a few minutes ago, and I decided just to throw it in there and engage it as well. I guess you could say this comment was in the right place at the right time to get engagement. So this individual says, I don't believe we can preclude the possibility that those ancient populations, such as Canaanites, Amalekites, were not entirely human in their bloodlines. And thus, we should view the genocide allegation as in a different manner. Okay, so what should we think about this? I suspect many people will recognize this kind of idea as the thought of Michael Heiser. Now, I do address this thought briefly in my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, and I know I've done either a video or an article on it in the past as well. I forget which. So I'll deal with it quickly here. The key issue, if we drill down here, is that it wasn't wrong to kill the Canaanites because they weren't fully human. They were a mix, right? Well, this is no different than all genocide or virtually all genocide rhetoric throughout history. So I often go back to David Livingstone Smith's book, Less Than Human, where he goes through the rhetoric that is a precursor to virtually every genocide, which always treats the target population of human beings as less than human. This was the case, for example, in Rwanda in 1994, when the Hutus otherized the Tutsis by describing them as cockroaches that needed to be eradicated. Same thing in World War II, when Hitler otherized the Jews as a hybrid, only partially human, that needed to be eradicated. This is the first step in genocide, in fact, is to treat populations as less than human. So your spidey senses should be very much tingling. You should be very suspicious whenever anybody attempts to eradicate entire civilian populations by saying they're less than human. So that would be the first thing to say here. Be very skeptical. This is an extremely dangerous rhetorical strategy. And if you employ this in the past, in principle, you could employ it in the future and say, oh, this group is also not fully human. So that's the first thing to be cautious about. Second thing to be cautious about is just because a population isn't fully human, I mean, even conceding that were the case, it doesn't follow that you can massacre their infants and small children. So even if they were partially human and partially not human, it doesn't follow that you can eradicate the populations of those people. The third thing I would just want to say is that we know who the modern day descendants genetically of the Canaanites are. They are in places like Lebanon, in the Middle East, in the Near East, and they're fully human. So, no, this doesn't hold up. Let's take a look at the next comment now. So this person says that doesn't follow. There are some hold that God can command genocide or the eradication of populations in the future, but many would say that because of the way our relationship with God has changed, God will not command that in the future. Because it was only morally right for God to command that under a situation which does not exist anymore. Let me just talk about that one. So this is really not a rebuttal. What this person is saying is, well, I don't think it's possible that God could command the eradication of populations again in the future. And I'll just say, okay, you may not think that. But the main problem is, first of all, that you've adopted an ethical view and a theological view that says there is nothing in principle wrong with eradicating, massacring civilian populations, including men, women, children, and infants. And if the circumstances obtained in the past were such was warranted and even required, in principle, circumstances could attain again in the future. And there are and have been many Christians who have believed, in fact, that the circumstances that obtained in the past have obtained again in the future, and they appeal to the Bible to justify acts of genocide and explicitly gave Philip Jenkins' book, Lay Down the Sword, as a historian providing examples from history where this has happened. And I used to work with a professor of Old Testament studies who had this view. I pressed him on it, and he conceded that on his interpretation of the book of Revelation, it is possible that God's people could again be co opted into fighting a battle which would involve the killing of civilian populations in a final apocalyptic judgment. He conceded that that was a possibility on his view. And I would say to this commenter, it's also a possibility on your view. The only place in which it's not a possibility is if you believe in principle God could not and would not command any such thing because such actions are intrinsically morally evil. Okay, let's now turn to the third comment from a troll. So this one is a trollish comment. First of all, because this person is trying to taunt. Second is because this person is either ignoring all of the things I've already done, all the work I've already done on this topic, or is egregiously ignorant about it. Here's the comment. So this person says, still ignoring the horrific context, Randall? Still don't want to know what the Canaanites were up to? Unbelievably pathetic. Your kind is the most dangerous, for ignorance of historical context has become a virtue for you. Okay, I'm not going to pick on the grammar here, but I will point out to this individual, I wrote a book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, in which I go into depth on what the Canaanites did, what the Canaanites are alleged to have done, what the Israelites did, and also comparing it in detailed analysis to a contemporary genocide, that in Rwanda. So this person simply does not know what they're talking about. Now, underlying this kind of response, however, setting aside the trollish patina to it, uh, the essence of it is, well, if the civilian population does something sufficiently an egregious nature that warrants eradicating the men, women, children, infants, mentally and physically handicapped, the elderly, everyone within the population. Uh, Clay Jones is the one person that I've critiqued on this because he wrote this essay, and I've consistently pointed out this is one of the worst essays ever published, in my view, in Philosophia Christi in about 2008 or 9. I'm just going to rehash some of that here because that is essentially channeling, or this person I think would be channeling essentially what Clay Jones argues. So I forget the title, but Jones's article is titled something like, um, if you have a, actually, let me just look up the title so we have it exactly. Hold on. So the title of Clay Jones's article from Philosophia Christi 2009 is this: We don't hate sin, so we don't understand what happened to the Canaanites. This is this takes gaslighting to like a whole new level. Jones's claim is that you have a problem, or we have a problem. The only reason that we have a problem with slaughtering men, women, and children and infants in ancient Canaan is because we don't appreciate how sinful the Canaanites were. That that truly that takes chutzpah. to gaslight people on this level. And I want to say that this article, that there are some articles that I think you can just argue they're not just neutral explorations of ideas. There's something intrinsically, fundamentally, morally disordered about them. I'm going to lay my cards on the table, and I think Judith Jarvis Thompson's famous essay, A Defense of Abortion, where she compares abortion to unhitching yourself from a concert violinist. There's something, in my view, that's disordered about that, morally disordered. It's a very bad argument. And not just a bad argument, but an argument with immoral repercussions that really taints the argument itself. I think something is similar when I think Peter Singer, for example, has argued in defense of zoophilia, or what we used to call bestiality. And when I come to something like this, we don't hate sin, so we don't understand what happened to the Canaanites. Where you have here a genocide apologist, as I call these people, Clay Jones, arguing that if we really understood how evil the Canaanites were, we would really understand why it was essential that they be slaughtered en masse. There is just something so grotesque about this kind of reasoning. Now, the great irony of Jones's essay, first of all, like these Christian of evangelical apologists, they really engage in this bald confirmation bias when they look for historical and textual evidence that somehow the Canaanites were these uniquely horrible people, and they'll select these little bits where you have some sort of graphic um, reference to in ancient Canaanite society to a bestial act and so on, and how some Canaanites at times practiced infant sacrifice, and then they'll say this is evidence of how horrific the Canaanites were morally. Now, the incredible gaslighting here is that, first of all, the Canaanites were not worse than other ancient Near Eastern peoples. This includes the Israelites. In fact, when the Israelites are slaughtering Canaanites in the book of Joshua, it is within a cultic context, a context of worship. It is what has been called Yahweh war, where the people of Yahweh are going into battle with the people of the gods of Canaan and defeating the gods of Canaan. And then they offer up through an act of harem all of the spoils of war to Yahweh. And as the smoke rises from the city of Jericho, that is like the smoke rising from the burnt sacrifice offering in the temple. That what is happening in Canaan is an echo of what happens, well, I should say later in the temple or in the tabernacle, but the offering of goods to Yahweh is a form of sacrifice. It's a type of worship for them. And the things that they give over to Yahweh then are sacrifices, the spoils of war. And within the land, the spoils of war include every living thing, men, women, and children, and animals should all be given over the spoils of war to Yahweh. That is human sacrifice. And it includes infants. So the extraordinary thing here is that these apologists, they argue the Canaanites were so evil for engaging in infant and child sacrifice. When the Israelites then punish them and engage in infant and child sacrifice as punishment, offering these children to Yahweh through an act of holy war. So that part of it is just beyond the pale. The other part of it that's so bad with Clay Jones's article is he stumbles into a ham-fisted defense of genocide against the American population. Because in the article, he argues that American society is not less bad than Canaanite society, from which it follows that if God was morally warranted in commanding the eradication of all living things in Canaan because of the moral corruption of Canaanite society, then in principle, God would be morally justified in eradicating the entirety of the American population because of American depravity. And then note that Clay Jones's evidence for how evil American society is just so awful. It's such a selected, as I say in my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, quote, his survey of American depravity is extraordinarily limited, arbitrary, and cherry-picked. He invokes such isolated cultural citations as a bestial theme in an art house film and an excerpted lyric from a Metallica song from the 1990s as evidence for a general societal corruption so absolute that it would warrant a punitive mass slaughter of the entire American population. And then I comment this. Here I must be blunt. Anyone who flirts with such an absurd and profoundly offensive bit of reasoning as this has on this point abdicated the most basic commitments and expectations of Christian discipleship. And the fact that this was published in a peer-reviewed academic journal of philosophy, I think I still think this is a publication of this article in 2009 is still a stain on their reputation of Philosophia Christi 15 years later. The fact that that passed peer review. So, to sum up, yeah, I don't find that to be very compelling as a response that the Canaanites were wicked. I mean, just imagine a thought experiment for a moment. You come upon a man who's killing an infant, a healthy infant, and you say to him, "How dare you do that? That is evil." And he responds to you, "Do you know what the family of this infant did?" What would your response be? Your response would be, "No, even if I don't know all the things that the family of that infant did, it doesn't warrant you killing that infant. And even if you don't know all the things that the Canaanite society did, you know that doesn't warrant killing the infants and small children of Canaanite society. It's just absurd." I want to conclude with a quote that I've often brought up in these instances, and it comes from Eleanor Stump. So, and I quote this again in Jesus Loves Canaanites. And I'm going to say, if you haven't done the deep dive on this, I strongly recommend you get Jesus Loves Canaanites. I'm going to link it below because this is important. Again, this is important to strip away any rationale or justification Christians have for violence, for exerting religious or theological violence on their enemies, including by appeals to a record of historic genocides and mass slaughter in the ancient Near East. Here's the quote from Eleanor Stump. He says, "It's true that our moral principles and our ethical theories rely on reason. But we build those principles and theories, at least in part, by beginning with strong intuitions about individual cases that exemplify wrongdoing. And we construct our ethical theories around those intuitions. We look for what the individual cases of wrongdoing have in common, and we try to codify those common characteristics into principles. Once the principles have been reorganized into a theory, we may also revise our original intuitions until we reach some point of reflective equilibrium where our intuitions and theories are in harmony. But our original intuitions retain an essential primacy." And then here comes the big point. She says, "If we found that our ethical theory countenanced Nazi experiments on children, we'd throw away the theory as something evil itself." It's no different if your theory entails that God commanded genocide, the eradication and indiscriminate killing of mass civilian populations, including men, women, and children and infants. That is disqualifying for that theory. That is the moral intuitions you have that such actions are intrinsically morally evil is always going to be stronger than any biblical or theological argument you want to make that sometimes genocide is warranted because they're not fully human, or because they did really terrible things, or because whatever the circumstances were, they were extreme, but they don't obtain anymore. None of those is a remotely plausible argument to overwhelm the overwhelmingly strong moral intuitions against these actions. And I would say, lastly, if you have no moral intuitions about these kinds of things, and I sometimes meet folks like this, that they'll at least claim, "It doesn't seem intrinsically wrong to me," then you might want to consider that you have a personality disorder. And I don't say that flippantly. But if a person has no moral intuitions about the intrinsic wrongness, a deep aversion to the intrinsic wrongness of killing infants, women, children, and so on, you might be a clinical psychopath, because clinical psychopathy is defined by the absence of this kind of moral compass and a response, a recognition of moral goodness and moral obligation. But for the rest of us, the moral intuitions that this is intrinsically wrong and evil is, if you're honest and you strip away the indoctrination of various communities, religious, political, social, etc., I think you'll be able to see that this is intrinsically wrong and evil.